Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on making career decisions in an era of uncertainty. I'm Kate Drabinski, and I am a senior lecturer at University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and I wanted to talk today about how to make career decisions because now's the time when contracts and offers are either coming in or they're not coming in. And we have to make the really hard decisions, a lot of us, about whether or not to stay looking for tenure track work, whether or not to take the adjunct position or the 1-year temporary position. How far do we move in order to do these temporary jobs? And how do we know when to step out and start pursuing work outside of the academy? So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And the way the webinar will work is in just a second, I will disappear from the screen and I'll pull up our PowerPoint presentation for today. And then I'll work through that. It'll take about 35, 40 minutes, right around there. And then if you have questions during the session, go ahead and type them in that little box right there. And we can talk about them when I get back. So on that note, I'm going to disappear and I'll see you on the flip side. All right, so this is, again, making career decisions in an era of uncertainty. On tap today, we're going to talk about first facing uncertainty, how to sort of deal with it and figure out what it means for you, and uncertainty in terms of what's right in front of you for the next year, but also what's in front of you for longer term career issues. Then we'll talk about setting priorities and considering options. We all have different priorities when it comes to the market, and also different things that keep us from maybe having the flexibility to move all over the country for temporary work. And then we'll think about a few different situations, career situations that you might be facing. First, tenure track jobs. If you got one of those, congratulations, if that's what you wanted. Contingency. So this, we'll talk about those jobs that have longer contracts, renewable, and sometimes even infinitely renewable, those sort of new long-term teaching positions that are coming up. We'll talk about adjuncting, deciding whether or not to do that. And then we'll talk about looking for work outside of the academy. And we'll end by discussing how to make an actual decision and then move on with your life. Right? Once the decision is made, you get to stop thinking about it. We also have some additional resources depending on what place in your career you're at that you might want to look at after we're done. All right, facing uncertainty. This is, I think, for me anyway, and in my many years on the job market, has been the very hardest thing. The job market is itself incredibly uncertain. Whether or not there's a job for any of us is, that's a question to ask the magic 8-ball. The job market is really terrible for a lot of fields, especially interdisciplinary and humanities fields that a lot of us are in. So what does that mean for you? How do you think about those larger structural issues in the academy and your own personal situation? And that is sort of very personal. And hopefully as we talk through some of the different career options some of us are facing, how to think about this will make sense to you. Other uncertainties that a lot of us face are things like needing to be near family, either because we want to be near family or because we need to due to family care that we're doing. Health issues, if you need to be near a certain set of doctors or you are undergoing ongoing treatment for something, you can't just up and move across the country necessarily. And then also thinking about future needs. As parents age, do you need to be within a certain distance of them? Do you want to have kids? And if so, is being near family important? So those kinds of issues are the kind of personal uncertainties that a lot of us face. So the combination of an uncertain job market that doesn't have enough room for all of us and the personal uncertainties that a lot of us have, making choices can be really tricky. In terms of career uncertainties, or thinking about your own individual position, there are a couple of questions I think it's useful to ask ourselves. First, what do you want to be when you grow up? A lot of us start graduate school because we were A+ students who really enjoyed reading and writing, and we want to keep doing that. And a lot of us made that decision when we were in our early 20s without a real sense of what a career is or what this career would actually look like. I know that in my universe, working inside the academy is there are a lot more meetings and there's a lot more paperwork than I was expecting. Next, think about what your personal priorities are. I think that in the academy, there's a real sense that your career has to be your first priority, and it isn't for all of us. And this is the webinar where I will say that's okay, right? We have different sets of needs. And when you're thinking about how to make decisions, think about what you can and can't live without. So for me, for example, it was really important that I be in the same time zone as my twin sister. And that, I think, to other people might sound silly, but we were apart by 3 time zones for years, and it didn't really work for the kind of life I wanted. So that was really important to me. It was really important to me to live in a place where I wouldn't be the only lesbian. So that is a really, I think sometimes when we're talking about the job market, it's like take whatever you get because it's so slim. But if that job is going to make you the second lesbian in town, maybe it's not, maybe there's another choice you want to make. So think about really seriously what you can and can't live without. So when you're sort of setting yourself up to make decisions, I want to talk a little bit about setting your priorities and also thinking about your options. Because I know for me, my priority was a tenure track job. That option has not come my way, so had to make other choices, right? So oftentimes there's a gap between priorities and options. But first, when thinking about priorities, think about what you like about this career. If you're looking for work inside the academy, what is it that you want to be doing? So for me, for example, what I really love is teaching. If I had not landed the permanently contingent job that I've landed, I would likely have taken those skills and thought about where else I could do things that were like being a teacher. So think about what it is that you actually genuinely want to do now that you're sort of through the hoops before making these decisions. Then I think it's really important to be clear about what other goals you have in your personal, social, or political life. I know that where I work, we've had faculty members choose to come here to Baltimore. That's where I am. Choose to come to Baltimore and then realize that their political work, it's really important they be on the West Coast and they be near the southern border. So if that's the issue, it's absolutely, I think, important to make it okay to make choices based on those needs. And then finally, think about what living a good life means to you. And what it is that you actually want. I think as academics, we're very rarely encouraged to think like this. We're usually encouraged to think, what's the fanciest job and the most money I could make? And if I can't get those things, then what am I going to scrape by with until it happens, right? That's sort of the mode, at least when I was in graduate school and early in my career, that's where we were at. So, but you only live one life. So think about what it is that's important to you, because those priorities are important to think about as you make your choices given your options. So in terms of options, if you have multiple options, congratulations, that's fantastic. So think about, so do you have offers on the table or do you expect them? If you've got an offer on the table, what other offers are you waiting for? I would definitely talk to some graduate school advisors about this, but think about calling those other places and seeing where they're at in the search. If you don't have offers and you're not necessarily expecting them, think about whether or not you have a time frame for how long you're willing to commit to the job market, the academic job market. What's your time frame for building this particular part of your career? A lot of us just do year after year waiting for the right job. And that's absolutely something we can do. But it's also possible to look outside of that track and think, well, what else could I do? So thinking about a time frame for how many years you're willing to search for a different kind of job than the one that you have, or to search for that first one before you start looking elsewhere. That's a question I think really worth asking, especially if we understand the career as part of life, but not your whole life. And then in terms of making decisions, think about what your short-term goals and your long-term goals, right? Because the short-term goal is, am I going to take this visiting assistant professor position at a school across the country for 1 year, right? So that's a decision to make for the short term. But longer term, is this the kind of position that's going to put me in place for the life I want to live 5 years from now? And to try and take some time to think about that long term and whether or not the short term decision moves you closer to that long term goal. All right, let's think about tenure track jobs. So now we're going to go into talking about different kinds of decisions you might be making right now. So first up, did you land one of those rare tenure track job offers? If so, congratulations, if that's what you want. I think that it's important before saying yes to whatever job it is to think about whether or not you want to take it. Do you want this job? And because it's set up as the kind of holy grail of academic job searches, of course, right? Of course, the answer to this is yes. But the job itself might not be the right one for you. And it's worth really thinking about that rather than getting dazzled by finally being able to, oh, I'll have a job for the rest of my life and I can be set. So some things to consider before saying yes to the tenure track job offer. First, location. Is it a place in the world where you're willing to live? Now, what's important to people in terms of where they live really varies, super individual. Like I said before, for me, I wanted to live somewhere where there were other lesbians and other queer people. So that was really important. I remember interviewing for a job in rural Maine, which was gorgeous, but I cried myself to sleep each night of that interview thinking about what if I had to live here I didn't know how to drive. I could have learned, but I didn't know how to drive. The pay was really low, and it was an incredibly small community. And I didn't get offered that job, and I'm still kind of grateful because at that point in my life, I think I would have said yes, because you say yes to whatever tenure track job offer you get. With some hindsight, thinking about what I want out of my life, that wouldn't have been a great choice. So think about location. For some of us, it matters a lot less, but if it matters to you, that's okay. Next thing to consider is career support. Will this job let me build the career that I want to build? So to use another example from my life, when I was offered this permanently contingent lecturer position at University of Maryland, Baltimore County, I had a tenure track campus interview lined up, but it was a 4-4 load at a school that at a small private liberal arts school without a strong endowment. And I looked at that and I thought, that's not necessarily what I want. It's got the word tenure in it, but my teaching load in this lecturer position would be lower and the resources would be higher. So I turned that down in order to take this contingent position. So think about, not all tenure track jobs are the same. So think about will this job support you in the way that you need it to? Next, I think something to consider is, I wrote down here, institutional habits. And by that, I mean, what kind of institution offered you the job? Is it the kind of place that you would feel good working? These are questions absolutely to ask yourself, especially if you have other options. Are the students that you want to teach? When you talk to other people who work there, do they seem happy? Does having a life outside of work seem like something people have, if that's something you want? We just completed a search in my department, and one of the things that I emphasized to our candidates was that where I work, there's a lot of support for the things that happen in your life. I had a major health issue last year. I was able to take time off at full pay. That's the kind of stuff that makes an institution the kind of place you might want to work. Now, of course, an institution can never love you back, so that's never going to be the up or down vote for me in decision making, but it's worth thinking about whether or not this is an institution you can imagine spending some real years. And this is I think this is important, especially if we think about long-term goals. What's your sort of long-term goal in the academy. And if it's to become a researcher, then some of the other parts of that you might not like about a particular job offer, I think, fall away. And so think about what your long-term goals are, and is this job going to move you towards them? The tenure, I think, can, in some places, is meaning less than it used to. So I don't think that that word is dazzling enough to automatically say yes to. It's worth thinking about. And regardless, you want to have the sense that you chose it, right? If you do have this job offer. Now let's talk about the positions that many of us are much more likely to be offered given the decline in tenure line positions. So I want to talk a little bit about thinking about contingency. So in terms of contingent positions, the first thing, and for this I mean long-term renewable contract positions, but also the shorter-term non-renewable fill-in positions, visiting assistant professors, postdocs, either teaching or research, these sort of very shorter-term positions. First, think about how contingent, try to figure out how contingent this contingent position really is. I'm on 5-year renewable contracts. That's much less contingent than a 1-year VAP that's replacing somebody on sabbatical. The chance of that getting renewed, very low. The chance of a lecturer position or a renewable postdoc getting renewed, much higher. Regardless, ask about renewability and if there's any chance. And if the answer is unlikely to be renewed, but there's always a chance, my suggestion is to hear what's being said there, which is that it's unlikely to be renewed. So if renewability is important to you and this temporary position would require a huge move, it might not necessarily be worth it if it's not a renewable position. Sometimes there will be talk of a possibility in the future. I have been here so many times. So here's my advice. Never think that those promises of some kind of future conversion are ever going to come true. They might, but that's not something to bank on. Overwhelmingly, what I've seen in these positions, from being in the contingent position with the promise made or watching these promises be made in departments in my current institution, is that they just don't necessarily come true, right? So the department might really want you to stay on and to renew your contract, but it's often not their call. And that's up at the dean or provost level. And they're just looking at the money and there's not a line for you and they're not going to make one, even if you're really great. I had a teaching postdoc at Tulane for a number of years and I thought I was really good. I taught a lot, got a lot of students in my classes, really popular. And you know what? Just didn't matter, right? It was a 3-year position. That was it. So beware that promise of something becoming available. Sometimes it's a 1-year position and they're doing a search. The chance that you will get that job because you're in the position at the moment, it can happen, but it's incredibly rare. So never bank on it would be my advice if you're trying to decide about a contingent position. Don't think, oh, it'll surely turn into something else. That helps me make my decision. Act as if it never will. So some things to consider before saying yes to this kind of position or making a decision about this is first, location. Again, do you want to live in this place? Second, and this is a really big deal because this is where a lot of us end up in excruciating credit card debt for years and years. How much is it going to cost to move there? If you have lived where you currently live for a long time and you have a lot of furniture or you're moving a family, the cost can be really, really high. And it might not be worth it. Always ask for moving expenses to be reimbursed, but know that reimbursements take a long time. So you have to have the cash up front or room on your credit card. Secondly, you will pay taxes on whatever they reimburse you for. So keep in mind that you are going to owe something back on that. My suggestion is to save about 25% of whatever they offer in moving expenses to cover the tax liability. So those are the two big things to keep in mind in terms of moving costs. There are lots of ways to keep moving costs down. I'll talk about that a bit later. Third thing to look at is there any career support offered in this contingent job? Some contingent jobs will, especially if it's like a postdoc, or it's a visiting assistant professor position, they'll sometimes come with some money for travel. So, and it's worth asking for it, right? Because this is a contingent position, but so you're going to be looking for something else. Do they have anything to offer in terms of career support so that you can say, go to MLA next year for interviews? Otherwise, you have to add that, the cost of taking the job, you have to add that to the cost of taking the job. And so that's, I think, important to think about. And then finally, does the position align with your future goals? If you think about where you want to be and what you want to be when you grow up, will this contingent position maybe move you forward? And if it will, I think these positions can be really worth taking. And if it's a long-term contingent position, it can also be a place to build a career. If teaching is something that is what you really want to do with this job. All right, next I want to think about that extra contingent position, adjuncting. This is often the kind of last choice when we haven't gotten other jobs on the job market and we've had to file our dissertation so we can't stay on as a PhD student. If our goal is to have a career in the academy, having institutional affiliation can be really important, and adjuncting can be a way to do that. So some things to consider when making the decision to adjunct is, first, can you make it work? And for this, I think it's important to be really, really honest with yourself. Can you make it work financially? Can you make it work in terms of time? A lot of us, when we're adjuncting, are working at multiple institutions. We're making between $2,000 and $4,000 a class. We might be teaching 6 or 8 a year to try and make ends meet. Is that something you want to do? And for a lot of us, a couple years of adjuncting is helpful for picking up experience and making connections. So adjuncting doesn't necessarily have to be this terrible thing, but can you actually make it work? And consider your priorities in terms of time, finances, and the career. Right? Is this something that that will move you towards your goals? And if it's not, it might be worth looking for another kind of work. So some things to consider as you make decisions about adjuncting is, first, can you afford it? Is the biggest one. Now I can hear myself also asking, well, can I afford not to? Right? Adjuncting is how I keep myself at least engaged in the academy, and the work I love to do is teaching, and so at least I get my soul fed a little bit, right? So can I afford it, but can I afford not to, is another question to ask yourself. Think about also what kind of career support your adjunct position can bring you. Now, almost always the answer is no support, right? Most adjuncts, in my experience and in my time as an adjunct, we don't have offices of our own. We are blocked from getting any kind of research or travel funds from our institutions. There's very little support. You really are kind of a disposable teacher. That said, it's worth asking the chair of the department if there's anything they can do. A lot of chairs are sympathetic to the plight of adjuncts. Maybe not a lot. Mine is. Some are, and so asking for it, I think, is worth doing. But if you don't get any career support, can you find that support elsewhere so that you can still do the things to build your academic career? If you do decide that adjuncting is your best option, I think it's really important to spend some time, and I would write down in my diary sort of what's good about this opportunity. Adjuncting is so difficult and it can be so unrewarding. Figuring out why you're doing it, actually being explicit for yourself. I'm doing this for these reasons, and this is a good opportunity for me for these reasons. Something you can return to in those moments when it feels like it's not worth doing, right? So remember, if you make the decision to adjunct, think about what's positive about that decision. And then finally, think about your own personal career time limits on how long you're willing to adjunct. Uh, I think this is a conversation that we should all be having a lot more often, in terms of how long we can afford, sort of emotionally, mentally, physically, and financially and spiritually, to stay adjuncting. So setting a time limit, as like hard as that sounds, because one more time, there's got to be a job out there. That kind of story that we tell ourselves, we can end up many years down the road still sort of accruing the debt of adjunctcy. So if I think that setting a time limit for yourself can be really useful, so that you, when you're making the decision, you're actively making it, and you know that you can make the decision not to adjunct. Finally, I want to think about career decisions outside of the academy, which for a lot of us are the decisions that we have to make when we've come to the end of our time as an adjunct or as a contingent faculty member. So some things to think about here is, first, what do you like about the profession, about the academy? And that can help you think about what kind of jobs you want outside the academy. So if what you like is research, right, think about, talk to your career services center, talk to your mentors and colleagues and people who work outside the academy. Where can I use these skills? Because that's what I want to do. Is it working for a nonprofit? Is it working for a think tank? Is it working in journalism, though that doesn't pay well anymore either? But if where can I use these skills? If what I really like is teaching, and I can't seem to find a job in higher ed, is teaching at high school level something that I would be interested in doing, right? So think about what you like, so that when you're looking for jobs outside the academy, you can find something you enjoy. Ideas on Fire has a program to learn how to be an academic editor. So if that's something, if what you like is the reading and the learning, looking into editing can be something that you can do. So think about what you like. That'll help you sort of situate your outside the academy job search. Then look at what options you have. And often it can feel completely overwhelming, and it's beyond the scope of this webinar, but just think about how to find a job outside the academy. Most of our advisors and mentors, their jobs are inside the academy. They're really good at that. They're bad at the rest of it. So there are a lot of resources online, and we'll have at the end of this, I have a link to some Ideas on Fire resources for thinking about what kind of options you have to work outside the academy. So some things to consider when making this choice is, first, is this a temporary or a permanent shift? Are you leaving the academy for good? This is a big decision. Now, of course, you can leave and sometimes return, but it is true that that's a much harder thing to do than even to just get a job out, right out of grad school. So think about that, about how to make that choice. Are you making the choice to permanently step out of the academy? That's really scary, and it feels like stepping off a cliff, but it can be a choice that also gives you back a sense of agency over your own future, and can be a really powerful moment to say, you know what, this isn't going to work. I can do something else. The next thing to consider is, will this job outside the academy supplement your work inside the academy, or will it supplant it? Is this, again, you're shifting outside of the academy altogether, or is it a side gig while you adjunct so that you can make ends meet, right? So when you're making those decisions, think about what it is that this job is for. So if it's a side gig to make money to supplement your adjunct position, the kind of work you do might be slightly less important. It might not have to move you towards a career. It might just be a side gig. And then finally, think about what roads open and close off if you make these decisions to leave the academy. Because sure, it might close off the road that leads to a research position at the institution, but it might open up roads to do administrative work, to do organizing work, to work in the art field, to teach in other places in other ways, right? So just like if you decide to adjunct, making clear what's good about it, I think making clear what's good about it, what roads open when you close off this one, can help this decision feel more like an actual decision. So just to summarize what we've talked about today, in terms of making decisions, the first and most important thing is to consider your priorities. It's listed second on this slide, but I think it's really first. What is it that you want out of your career? Advisor wants, not what I thought you would want when you were 25. Or what do you actually want? What are your priorities in your life? I had a tenured professor ask me a couple of years ago if she said, "Do you think your advisor's ever disappointed in you?" And it was such a strange question, and I understood what she was getting at. And she just lived in a different world than I did because I was making decisions based on what I needed for my life, not what I thought I was supposed to want. Right. So think about what your priorities are about your life. I think it's the most important thing to think about before making these decisions. Next, consider your options. Some of us have a lot of options. Some of us have one option or maybe two, right? You always have it like the option to leave the academy. Adjuncting is usually an option, especially if we're near our home institutions. They'll often give us a class or two. But what are your options? And if you have very few, the question is really just yes or no. And that's something that you'll have to make. Also, when making decisions, keep timeframes in mind, right? Like how long will the ramifications of this decision last? If it's a visiting assistant professor position somewhere, that's a 1-year position. If it's near where I live, so I don't have to move, that's fantastic, right? So in terms of the time frame, that's fine, right? But if it's across the country or it's our third or fourth visiting position in a row, one's got to start to think like, how long will I stay on this particular merry-go-round? And then finally, when you do decide, choose, make that choice, make that decision, and then commit to it. And it's amazing how quickly other decisions you could have made go out the window once you've made your decision for the short term and the long term. And know that you can always change course, right? It is not the case that once you take that tenure track job, like you can never leave. You must work there forever. Even once you get tenure, you don't have to stay in the academy. It does make it a little bit harder to move sometimes, but you're never really trapped the way I think some of the rhetoric of the academic job market goes. So choose, commit to it, get excited, and know that you can always change your mind. So that wraps up today's webinar. We do have some resources, and you'll get these slides in your email. If you, that I think some other resources that I think might be helpful. So if your choice means that you have to move, we have a webinar that we did last summer called Making Moving Easier. And I did the webinar and I've moved cross country 5 times, 5 or 6, a lot of times. I've moved across the country. I've moved with professional moving companies in a Penske truck, shipping everything UPS, using one of those cubes where they drop it. I've moved every way you can move. And so that webinar, I think, has some great tips for how to organize a move and do it as inexpensively as possible. We also have a webinar about side gigs and how they can supplement your adjunct money and also sometimes open up new career possibilities. So that's something that you might find useful. And then finally, if you're frozen by the stream of rejections that accompany every job season, I know I've been rejected from hundreds of jobs, it can get really hard, especially before you've built up the calluses for it. So we also have a webinar on dealing with rejection and how to not get completely stymied by it. So those are some other resources that we thought you might find useful. Hopefully you're all already signed up for our newsletter. But if not, please do, and you can learn about other webinars that are coming up. All right, so now I'm back. Hello, and that's the end of our webinar. So any questions or thoughts or anyone actively making a decision they'd like to discuss? If so, you can write it in that box. I've decided hydration's very important. All right, well, thank you all for joining us today, and hopefully this was useful, and I wish all of you many, many decisions to make. Having options is, if you're lucky enough to have options, congratulations. We should all be so lucky. So happy decision making, and I'll see you next month.